The helicopters were already in the air. Then someone made a phone call, and they turned around. 12 elite operators, surrounded, outgunned. 7 minutes before Christmas, and the people sworn to bring them home just left them there. One woman watched it happen through a rifle scope from half a mile away, suspended, facing court-martial. One magazine of ammunition between her and the end of 12 lives. She had 18 rounds. They had 18 reasons to die. She chose differently. Subscribe right now. Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled, and hit that like button, because what happens next will stay with you long after the credits roll. The cold came first. It always did in Ravenport, not the kind of cold that bites at your cheeks and makes you think of hot coffee and warm blankets. This was the other kind, the kind that seeps through body armor and Kevlar and 3 layers of thermal underlayer and still finds the marrow of your bones. The kind that whispers that the world was not designed for living things. That winter in this city was not a season. It was a sentence. Ravenport had been beautiful once. There were photographs to prove it. Cobblestone plazas, cathedral spires, Christmas markets that stretched for 6 city blocks with lights strung between lampposts like constellations you could walk through. People had danced here. Children had thrown snowballs at each other near the old fountain in Veldmark Square. Someone, somewhere, still had home videos of that. Still had proof that this place had once been alive in the right kind of way. That was before the factions carved it into territories, before the checkpoints went up on Brenner Street and the militia boys started charging tolls to cross them, before the car bombs and the sniper alleys and the slow, grinding erasure of everything that had made Ravenport worth fighting over in the first place. Now the Christmas lights still hung between those same lampposts, blinking, half dead, some flickering in colors that didn't quite match anymore because the bulbs had been replaced so many times with whatever was available, and they cast the ruins in something that looked almost festive if you didn't look too closely. If you didn't see the bullet pocks in the concrete walls beneath them. If you didn't notice that the lights reflected off broken glass instead of polished storefronts. Captain Ethan Cross noticed. He noticed everything. That was the job. That was what 12 years of special operations had ground into him. The ability to process a street, a rooftop, a doorway, a shadow at 3 in the morning, and file it all away in the 2 seconds before something tried to kill you. He moved through the back alley off Dresner Lane with his team spread behind him in a staggered column, and his eyes were already on the building at the end of the block before his boots had cleared the corner. Target structure. 6-story former textile warehouse, northeast quadrant of the city's old industrial district. Pre-war maps called it the Hessel Building. Current intelligence called it something else. A logistics hub for Commander Varric Osen's mid-tier weapons distribution network. The kind of operation that fed guns to 3 different factions without ever picking a side. The kind of operation that kept a civil war running on fumes when it should have collapsed under its own weight 2 years ago. The mission brief had used the word routine 4 times. Ethan had learned to distrust that word the way he distrusted calm water in places where things lived underwater. Ghost. Actual, this is Ghost 2. The voice in his earpiece belonged to Sergeant First Class Derek Munn. Point man, 6'4", built like a construction crane, whispered like a librarian when he was working. South entrance clear. Roll-up door is padlocked from the inside, but there's a personnel door to the left. Hinges look fresh. Fresh how? Ethan murmured back. Like somebody replaced them in the last week. New metal, no rust. Ethan stopped walking, just for a breath, just long enough to let that detail land where it needed to land. New hinges on a warehouse door in a city where every piece of metal that wasn't nailed down had been stripped for parts or sold for scrap. That was not a detail that belonged to a routine weapons cache. That was a detail that belonged to a place someone cared about, a place someone was maintaining, a place someone expected to use again. Rains, he said quietly. Behind him, Staff Sergeant Carla Rains moved up without being told twice. She was the team's intelligence specialist, which in practice meant she was the person who read the spaces between facts and told you what lived there. Compact, dark-haired, with the particular stillness of someone who had learned that movement attracted attention, and attention got people killed. She stopped next to Ethan, and he didn't say anything, just tilted his head toward the end of the alley. She looked at the building, looked at the street approach, looked at the roof lines. "There are no pigeons," she said. "Say again?" "On the roof lines. Every other building on this block has pigeons roosting. Even in this cold, they find the vents, the overhangs. That building has none." She paused. "Something's been disturbing them, regularly, recently." Ethan pressed his tongue against the back of his teeth. Around him, the team had compressed into the shadow of the alley wall. 10 operators, plus himself and Munn at point, all of them watching him do the math. Ghost team. 12 people selected from the best of 3 different special operations units, assembled for exactly this kind of work. Precision raids, high-value targets, in and out before the city woke up and started asking questions. He keyed his radio. "Overwatch, Ghost Actual. What's your picture? From elevation." The response came from Lieutenant Colonel Harlan Briggs at the forward command post, 2 kilometers away, watching satellite and drone feeds. "Ghost Actual, Overwatch. Picture looks clean. Thermal shows 4 to 6 heat signatures inside, ground floor, nothing on upper levels. You are clear to proceed." 4 to 6. That matched the brief. A skeleton crew running the cache on a holiday night because nobody expected a raid 7 minutes before Christmas. Ethan looked at the new hinges. He looked at the empty roof lines. He said, "Copy, Overwatch," and moved his team forward. But the ground floor of the Heisel building smelled like machine oil and something older, wet concrete, and the particular rot of a space that had been closed up and reopened too many times. Emergency lighting cast everything in a dim amber that made shadows pool in the corners and turned faces into masks. Crates were stacked against the far wall, but wooden, military grade, the kind that were built to survive rough transport across bad roads. Munn moved to the nearest one, tested the latch, cracked the lid. He looked inside for 2 seconds. Then he looked back at Ethan. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The crate was empty. Not empty like it had been unpacked, empty like it had never been filled. The wood was fresh, the foam packing inserts were clean. This was a crate that had been placed here to be found. Ethan turned in a slow circle. 4 to 6 heat signatures on thermal, ground floor. He counted the team around him, 12 people with rifles up, scanning corners, moving through the space in overlapping arcs of coverage. He counted the crates. He counted the exits. 2 confirmed entrances. 1 roll-up door they hadn't touched, and the personnel door they'd come through, now sealed behind them because that was the protocol. Control your entry and exit. Don't leave a door open behind you because open doors let things in. Things like the 2 armed men who stepped out of the shadows near the east stairwell. "Ghost, contact, Ba spunk ba," someone started, and then the building exploded. Not literally, not all at once. But the concussive crack of the first explosion came from the street outside, a detonation that shook the windows and sent dust raining from the ceiling, and it was followed immediately by the metallic hammering of automatic weapons fire from the floor above them, through the ceiling, rounds punching through industrial flooring and kicking sparks off the concrete at their feet as they scattered. "Contact above. Take cover." Ethan moved without thinking. 12 years of training and the muscle memory that lives below thought. He was behind the largest crate stack before the second burst of fire came down, Rains dropping beside him, both of them already scanning up as plaster dust and wood chips rained. To his left, he could see Munn dragging Private First Class Owen Kessler back from the stairwell. Kessler was moving, unhurt, but Munn's hand on his collar was the difference between cover and standing in the open. The 2 armed men near the east stairwell had dissolved back into the shadows. Of course they had. They hadn't been there to fight, they'd been there to be seen, to tell the team there was human presence on the ground floor, give them something to focus on while the real threat positioned above. Ghost Actual, SITREP. Ethan's voice was level. Not because he felt level, because the radio required level. "We are in contact. Structure is compromised. Requesting immediate extraction confirmation." "How copy?" Static. Then Briggs. Ghost Actual Overwatch copies. Be advised, we are tracking multiple squads converging on your position from the north and east. Estimate 40 plus personnel. What is your status? 40. Plus whoever was above them right now, still firing in controlled bursts, 3-round groups, disciplined. Someone up there who knew what they were doing. Status is 12 operators in a building that was a trap, Ethan said. We need extraction, now. A long pause. Too long. The kind of pause that had a conversation happening inside it that Ethan wasn't part of. Ghost Actual, stand by. Stand by. Munn was next to him now, back against the same crate, ejecting a partial magazine and replacing it with a full one, even though he'd fired exactly 0 rounds because Munn had been doing this long enough to know you top off before a firefight, not during. He looked at Ethan with an expression that was not quite fear and not quite anger, something in between that had no clean name in English. Stand by, Munn repeated. Flat. No inflection. I heard it. 40 guys, Cap. I heard that too. We got maybe 400 rounds between 12 people. I know, Derek. Munn didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. 400 rounds against 40 combatants in a building at night with no extraction confirmed. The math wasn't complicated. The math was brutal and simple, and they both knew what it added up to. The firing from above had paused, which was worse somehow. A pause meant repositioning. Repositioning meant they were setting something up. Ethan keyed the radio again. Overwatch, Ghost Actual, I need an extraction window. We cannot hold this position indefinitely. Ghost Actual? Briggs's voice had changed. Something in the register had shifted in a way that Ethan recognized from 3 previous deployments and 2 previous commands. The shift that happened when someone on the other end of the radio was not making the call themselves. When there was a hand on their shoulder. When there was a voice in their ear from somewhere above their pay grade. Ghost Actual, be advised. Command is assessing the situation. You are ordered to hold position and await further guidance. The words landed like stones in still water. Assessing. Hold position. Overwatch, Ethan said carefully. I want to make sure I understand. 40 armed personnel are converging on our location. We have limited ammunition. We have no confirmed extraction window. And command is assessing. That is correct, Ghost Actual. Overwatch, I have 12 people in this building. Understood, Ghost Actual. Do they understand that? Another pause, then. You are ordered to hold position. Await further guidance. Overwatch out. The radio went quiet in a way that felt permanent. Ethan lowered his hand from the earpiece. Around him, the team had redistributed. Rains and 2 others covering the stairwell. Munn at the west wall watching the approach through a gap in the boarded windows. Specialist Tommy Hatch at the roll-up door with a mirror on a collapsible rod checking the street outside. They had all heard the radio traffic. In a tight team like this, on a radio channel shared across the element, there were no private conversations. They all knew. Hatch spoke without turning from the door. His voice was quiet, controlled, the kind of controlled that took effort. Captain, street's filling up. I count 12, 15 hostiles on the north approach. More coming. Rains. Stairwell is blocked. They've stacked something heavy on the upper landing. They're not coming down yet. They're waiting. Waiting. Of course they were. If you had 40 people surrounding a building with 12 people inside, you didn't rush in and trade casualties. You waited. You tightened the circle. You let the cold in the clock and the silence do the work for you. Ethan Cross had been in bad situations before. Fallujah. Kandahar. 3 years ago in a riverside town whose name he wasn't cleared to speak in certain company, where a mission had gone wrong in ways that still showed up in his sleep sometimes. He had been shot at and blown up and left without support in the middle of enemy territory with his boots soaking through and his radio dead, and had found a way out every single time because there was always something, always a variable that hadn't been accounted for, always a door that opened, always a choice that hadn't been made yet. He looked around the amber-lit warehouse at 11 people who had followed him in here. He thought about the word routine. He thought about new hinges. He thought about pigeons that weren't there. He got back on the radio. Overwatch, Ghost Actual, final request. We are going to be overrun within 20 minutes. I need extraction. I need it now. I need someone to look me in the eye on this frequency and tell me those helicopters are coming. The wait this time was 43 seconds. Ethan counted. When Briggs came back, his voice had the quality of a man delivering a sentence he did not write. Ghost Actual. Extraction assets have been recalled. Command is exploring diplomatic options regarding the situation in sector. You are ordered to hold your position and await further guidance. This is a direct order. Recalled. The helicopters were gone. They had been turned around. Munn was looking at him. Rains was looking at him. Rains. Hatch and Kessler and the 8 other people in this building who had trusted him to lead them in were looking at him, or looking at the walls, or looking at nothing, because sometimes what you feel is too large for your face to carry, and you have to put it somewhere else. Ethan set his jaw. He thought about 12 people and 400 rounds and 40 enemies closing a circle in the dark. He thought about a Christmas he was going to miss. He pressed the transmit button one more time. Overwatch, understood. A breath. Ghost Actual out. He released the button. Munn said very quietly, "So that's it. That's the order." I wasn't asking about the order. Ethan looked at him, at the lines around Munn's eyes that hadn't been there 4 years ago, at the wedding ring he'd never taken off despite everything, at the man who had followed him into more bad rooms than either of them could count without getting drunk first. "No," Ethan said. "That's not it." He turned to face the team, all 11 of them, waiting. "Listen up." His voice didn't shake. He wouldn't let it. "I'm not going to tell you the situation is good because you all heard the radio, and you're not stupid. Command has recalled extraction. We are surrounded, and we are undergunned, and we are about to have a very bad 20 minutes. He let that sit for exactly 1 second. And none of that changes what we do next. We hold this position. We protect each other. We make every round count. And we look for the opening. Because there is always an opening. You understand me? Nobody said yes. They didn't have to. The way Rain shifted her grip on her rifle. The way Munn nodded once, slow. The way he nodded when things were about to get serious and he was ready for them. The way Hatch turned back to the door. That was yes enough. Outside, the blinking Christmas lights reflected off the snow-dusted street in colors that had no business being beautiful, and were anyway. The circle was tightening. 40 armed men who had been waiting for this moment moved into their final positions around the Heysel building with the patience of people who knew the end was already written. They had been told the building was surrounded. They had been told there was no way out. They had been told exactly where 12 operators would spend the last minutes of Christmas Eve. What nobody had told them, what nobody in that carefully planned trap had accounted for, was the figure on the rooftop half a mile away. The one who had been watching the circle close through the glass of a Schmidt and Bender scope since before the first shot was fired. The one who had a radio earpiece in one ear and a cold, gathering silence in the other, and who was running a calculation that headquarters had already declared impossible. 18 rounds, 12 lives, 90 seconds. Nobody had told them about her. The first crack of automatic fire from the upper floor came back at 11:53 p.m., and this time it wasn't warning shots through the ceiling. This time it was coordinated. The windows on the north and south walls of the warehouse shattered simultaneously as shooters outside opened up, suppressing fire, pinning the team flat behind crates and support columns, while the group on the upper floor began moving down the stairwell. Ethan heard it through the ceiling, the creak and thud of boots on metal stairs, slow and deliberate, the sound of people who weren't afraid of the people below them. "Stairwell's moving," Rains shouted. "I hear it. Munn, north window. On it." Ethan was moving along the east wall, keeping low, rifle up, when the roll-up door at the south end of the building groaned and buckled, something heavy hitting it from outside, a vehicle or a battering ram, the corrugated metal bowing inward in a long, shuddering wave. 400 rounds, 40 enemies. He did the math one more time, automatically, the way you tongue a loose tooth. He already knew the answer. He'd known it since Briggs said recalled. The stairwell door flew open, and from somewhere outside, from somewhere distant and elevated in a direction that didn't match any of the incoming fire, there was a sound. A single, suppressed shot. Small, almost delicate. The kind of sound that didn't belong in the middle of a firefight because it was too controlled, too deliberate, too precise for the chaos surrounding it. The first man through the stairwell door dropped without firing a single round, and then everything went very, very strange. The man dropped like his strings had been cut. No dramatic fall, no stumbling back into the doorframe. He simply stopped being upright. One moment a threat moving through a doorway with a weapon raised, the next a shape on the floor that the rest of the team on the stairwell had to step around or stop or process. And processing took time. Even trained fighters needed a half second to understand what they were seeing when something happened that didn't fit the script they'd been handed. That half second was everything. Ethan was already moving before his brain had fully caught up to what his eyes had registered. He grabbed Rains by the shoulder strap of her plate carrier and pulled her left, away from the stairwell door, because whoever had just taken that shot had done so from outside, from elevation, and had done it through a window gap that Ethan hadn't even clocked as an angle, which meant there was someone out there with a line of sight he hadn't mapped, which meant the geometry of this room had just changed in a way he didn't fully understand yet. "Stairwell, hold," he barked. "Cap, what? Something's outside, working the roof lines. Don't bunch at the stairwell door, spread." Another shot. Same quality, suppressed, precise, carrying the particular flat crack of a subsonic round moving through cold air. This one came from a different angle, slightly north of the first, and on the street outside, through the buckled gap at the base of the roll-up door, Ethan heard something he hadn't heard in the last 4 minutes of this firefight. Someone screaming in a language he didn't speak, a short burst of panicked shouting, and then silence that was the specific silence of people who had been moving and suddenly stopped. Munn was at the north window. He turned his head. In the amber emergency light, his face was unreadable, but his eyes were doing the thing they did when Munn was recalibrating, pupils moving, scanning, filing. Cap. Flat. Careful. They're pulling back from the north approach. How many? Was 8. Now there's 4 and they're looking at the roof lines, not at us. Ethan processed that. 8 men on a coordinated approach, pulling back because 2 shots from elevation had reoriented their threat assessment from the building in front of them to the darkness above and behind them. That was not a suppressor on a standard rifle. That was marksmanship at a range and angle that made professional soldiers reconsider their position. "Who the hell?" Hatch started. "I don't know." Ethan moved to the east wall. "And right now, it doesn't matter. It matters later. Right now, we take whatever this is, and we use it." So, half a mile northeast, on the frost-slicked surface of a 6-story residential building whose top-floor tenants had evacuated 3 weeks ago when the militias started running checkpoints on Brenner Street, Lena Mercer was already moving to her secondary position. She'd planned 4. She always planned 4. Primary was the northwest corner of the roof, prone behind a collapsed section of parapet wall that gave her 18 inches of concealment and a sight line straight down the main approach corridor to the Hessel building. She'd been there since 10:40 p.m., which was before Ghost Team had even left their staging area, which was how long she'd been watching this play out. Secondary was the southeast corner, tighter angle, longer shot to the building's south face, but it covered the roll-up door approach and the alley system that fed into the block from the east. Tertiary was the roof access stairwell housing on the north side, which she'd use if she needed elevation cover and speed over precision. Quaternary was the fire escape on the building's west face, which she was never going to use unless she had no other option, because fire escapes in Ravenport's old industrial district were approximately 70% reliable, and she had not survived 11 years of this work by betting on 70%. She reached secondary in 9 seconds. Prone, rifle up, eye to the glass. The Schmidt and Bender was a 3 to 20 times 50 PM Shem II. The kind of optic that cost more than some people's cars and earned every cent of it in conditions exactly like these. Low light, cold air creating variable density layers, targets at mixed distances between 300 and 600 meters. She'd zeroed it herself 2 days ago on a private range outside the city, in conditions as close to tonight as she could simulate. She had also checked the zero this morning, because she was the kind of person who checked the zero every time, even when she'd checked it the day before. because the alternative was being the kind of person who didn't, and she had seen what happened to that kind of person. 1 magazine. 18 rounds. She'd counted them 3 times before she'd climbed onto this roof, the same way she always counted things she couldn't afford to be wrong about. Through the scope, she tracked the south approach. 4 men using the alley mouth as a staging point, stacked in pairs, waiting for whatever signal was going to send them at the roll-up door with whatever they'd been planning to use to get through it. She'd seen them test it once already, felt the impact transmitted through the city block even from this distance. They had a vehicle-mounted ram on a truck 2 blocks east. They were setting up for a breach. She ranged the nearest one, 412 meters. Wind from the northwest at 6 knots, gusting to 9. Temperature minus 14 Celsius, which at this range affected bullet drop by a margin she'd already factored into her dope card, which was taped to the back of her left forearm in her own handwriting in a font small enough that nobody else could read it without a magnifying glass. She breathed. Lena Mercer had been described in her official service record as technically proficient but temperamentally unsuitable for command environments. She had read that once, folded the paper, handed it back, and said nothing. The officer who'd written it had later been promoted. She had later been handed a suspension pending court-martial review. The Army had a complicated relationship with people who were right in ways that made the institution uncomfortable, and Lena had spent 11 years being that kind of right on a near-continuous basis. She was not thinking about any of that right now. She was thinking about 412 meters and 6 knots and minus 14 and the particular way the man in her crosshairs was carrying his weight on his front foot, which told her he was about to move. She squeezed. The trigger broke cleanly. The rifle moved. She was already tracking left before the recoil had fully settled, because the second man in the pair was going to react to the first going down, and the reaction was going to take him either toward the body or away from it, and either direction brought him into her next line. He went toward the body. They usually did. Something deep and animal about the proximity of death that makes people move toward it before their training overrides their instinct. She squeezed again. 2 down. The remaining pair scattered, one back toward the alley mouth, one flat against the wall of the building to his right. She tracked the one against the wall. He had his radio up. He was calling something in. She could not hear it, but she had spent enough time in enough cities watching enough people do exactly this that she could read the body language from 400 meters like subtitles on a screen. He's reporting the position of the shots. She was already moving before the thought finished forming. Rifle up, pulling back from secondary, going to tertiary. The stairwell housing on the north side. 9 seconds the other way. Behind her, on the street below, she heard shouting. Multiple voices now, in multiple directions. The circle around the Heysel building was fracturing. Not collapsing, not yet, but the neat geometry of 40 men closing in from coordinated vectors was coming apart at the edges because edges were where she was working. That was the point. She wasn't trying to win a firefight against 40 people with 18 rounds. That was not a winnable calculation, and she had never confused herself into thinking it was. What she was doing was something more specific and in some ways more demanding. She was making 40 people feel like they were surrounded. She was introducing uncertainty into a situation that had been designed to be certain. She was taking the one thing that gave the attackers their advantage, the knowledge of exactly where the threat was and exactly where it wasn't. And she was dismantling it from the outside. 3 shots, 3 positions, all from different angles, all in the same 90-second window. By the time they triangulated the first position, she was gone. By the time they identified the second angle, she was somewhere else. By the time they figured out there was only one shooter, she was going to have already changed the shape of this thing enough that the math tilted in a direction headquarters had decided was impossible. Headquarters. She thought about that word and felt something cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. She'd been monitoring the radio net since 10:20 p.m. Not on her unit frequency. She'd been pulled from that the moment the suspension came through, access codes revoked, channels reassigned. But there were other ways to listen if you knew what equipment to use and where to point it, and Lena had spent 2 years doing signals intelligence work before she'd come back to direct action, and the knowledge of how things worked had not evaporated with her clearance. She'd heard the mission launch. She'd heard the initial contact report. She'd heard Ethan Cross. She didn't know his name then, just Ghost Actual. Just a voice with a particular steadiness to it that she recognized as someone working very hard to sound calmer than they felt. She'd heard him request extraction. She'd heard the pause. She'd heard the answer, recalled. She'd taken the radio earpiece out of her ear very deliberately, the way you set down a glass you're about to throw, and she'd laid it on the concrete beside her primary position. She hadn't thrown it. She'd just set it there where she could see it, because she'd wanted to remember exactly what moment it had become irrelevant. Then she'd checked her magazine one more time, counted 18 rounds with her fingertips, one by one, in the dark, the way a person counts things they cannot afford to miscount, and she'd gone to work. At the Hassel building, the shift was slow enough to be maddening and fast enough to be real. Ethan was tracking it through the gaps in the boarded windows. The north approach that had been 8 men was now 3, and those 3 were looking up and outward rather than forward. The east alley, which had been channeling a second element toward the building, had gone quiet in a way that had nothing to do with coordination and everything to do with people who'd heard shots and stopped moving until they understood where they were coming from. The stairwell above them had gone silent, too. The boots on the metal steps had retreated up, which meant the people who'd been descending had heard the comms from their colleagues outside and made the rational decision that moving through a fatal funnel into an unknown engagement was a bad idea until the picture cleared. The circle had not broken. It had paused. Rains. Ethan moved to her position at the stairwell door. What's our ammo count, actual? She didn't look up from her position. I ran it 10 minutes ago. 380? 390? Kessler's down to 2 mags. Burns used 1 in the initial contact. Everyone else is close to standard. So the 400 I estimated was optimistic. By about 10 to 15, yeah. He crouched beside her. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The building groaned around them. Temperature differential, old metal contracting in the cold, the structural language of a place that had survived a lot and was expressing opinions about being asked to survive more. Someone's out there, Rains said. Not a question. Yeah. Friendly? If they weren't, we'd all be dead. They've had shots at our windows. She absorbed that. So who? Ethan shook his head once. Later. Cap. Her voice dropped lower. If they're working alone, if this is one person, they can't keep this up. The circle closes again the second command figures out the angle. I know. We have maybe a 10-minute window before the attackers recalibrate. Whatever opening appears, we have to move through it. I know that too. So what's the play? He looked at her. Carla Rains had been doing this job for 8 years, and in 8 years he had never seen her look frightened. Not in Kandahar, not in the river town, not tonight. What she looked right now was precise, focused in the particular way of someone who has stripped away everything that doesn't serve the next 10 minutes. We find the corridor, he said. When the firing outside creates a gap, any gap, we move through it fast, and we don't stop moving until we're 3 blocks clear of this building. And if extraction is still recalled, then we move until our legs give out, and we figure the rest out when we get there. Munn appeared at his shoulder. Cap. Roll up door. Ethan moved to the south wall. Through the gap at the base of the door, the street had changed. The vehicle he'd heard earlier, the one they'd been using for the door breach, was visible now, but it wasn't moving toward them. It was stopped at an angle in the street 60 meters south, and the 2 men beside it were not looking at the building. They were looking north, up the approach, with the particular body language of people trying to figure out where something came from. Another shot. This one was different, closer, sharper, coming from the northeast instead of the earlier northwest angle, and the effect on the street was immediate. Both men at the vehicle moved. One went behind the truck. One went flat in the gutter. Neither of them was moving toward the Hessel building anymore. She's moving, Ethan said, and then caught himself. Munn looked at him sideways. She? Ethan didn't answer that. He filed the pronoun away for later and focused on the street. The gap near the roll-up door had widened by maybe 20 meters. A rough corridor of street that nobody was currently occupying, running from the south face of the building to a side alley that fed west, away from the tightening circle. 20 meters. Maybe 30 seconds before someone repositioned to cover it again. He turned around. Everybody up! On me! Now! Bam. What happened in the next 4 minutes was the kind of thing that got written up in after-action reports in language so compressed and clinical that it bore almost no resemblance to what it felt like to be inside it. The after-action report would say, Team exfiltrated via south egress, used available cover, moved west on Dresner parallel, sustained no casualties during exfil phase. What it felt like was 12 people running through a half-dark street in body armor and full kit on Christmas Eve, breath coming in visible clouds, boots on ice-slicked cobblestones, the sound of shouting in 3 languages mixing with the wind and the distant crackle of gunfire that kept relocating, north, then east, then north again. Never quite where the people chasing them expected it to be. Someone on the rooftops was hunting every fighter who tried to reposition to cut off the corridor. Ethan ran. He ran and he counted his people. 1, 2, 3 in front, Munn at his shoulder, Rains behind, the cluster of the team spreading into a loose wedge as they moved. And he kept counting, because counting was the only thing he had right now, the only metric that mattered. 12 in and 12 out was the only math he was willing to accept. He got to 7 in his count, and the shot came from directly above. Not at his team. At the intersection 30 meters ahead, where 2 fighters were stepping out from behind a burnt-out cargo van with rifles leveled. The nearest one dropped before he'd completed the step. The second one dove back behind the van and stayed there. Ethan didn't stop running. He ran through the intersection in 4 seconds and didn't look back. 8, 9, 10, 11. He turned. Munn was the last one through, moving at a pace that should not have been possible for a man his size in full kit, and he cleared the intersection and grabbed the corner of the building on the far side and spun to face back the way they'd come, rifle up, scanning. Nothing came through the intersection behind them. The shooting to the north was sporadic now. 2, 3 shots, then silence, then one more. The pattern of someone who was being careful about ammunition, someone who knew exactly how much they had left and was spending it like currency they couldn't afford to waste. 12. 12 people. All of them running west on Dresner parallel, all of them still breathing, none of them dead. Ethan keyed his radio. Overwatch, Ghost Actual. We are on the move, south exfil, Dresner parallel westbound. 12 personnel, no casualties. I say again, no casualties. Request you relay our position to any asset in the area. The pause this time was shorter. When Briggs came back, something in his voice had changed in a way Ethan couldn't fully name. Tighter, or maybe the opposite of tight. Something released. Ghost Actual, Overwatch copies. Be advised, we are tracking your movement. Continue west on Dresner. There's an extraction asset being repositioned to grid Kilo 7. Ethan almost stopped running. Being repositioned. Past tense of recalled. Something that had been sent away was being sent back. Copy Overwatch. He ran. Who authorized? Another pause. Above my pay grade, Ghost Actual. Just run. He ran. Behind them, on rooftops that were already becoming harder to identify in the dark and distance, the shooting had stopped. Lena Mercer had gone quiet. Whether that was by choice or necessity, Ethan didn't know. He wouldn't know for a while yet. What he knew was that the last time he'd heard a shot, it had been from somewhere to the northeast, and it had cleared the path his team was now running through, and the silence that followed it felt less like an ending and more like someone letting out a long-held breath. The team ran. The Christmas lights of Ravenport blinked and flickered overhead, casting red and green on snow that was doing its best to cover the evidence of everything that had happened on these streets. 3 blocks west of the Heisel building, a building that was already behind them, already becoming a place that would live in 12 different sets of memories in 12 different ways. They didn't celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate yet. The helicopters might not come. The grid point might be a different kind of trap. The 40 men might regroup faster than expected and find the corridor they'd just run through. Munn was breathing hard beside him. Not labored, not compromised. The hard, clean breathing of a man at the edge of his aerobic limit, doing exactly what he'd trained to do. Rains was scanning left as she ran. Hatch was counting something on his fingers, probably ammo, probably finding the number unsatisfying. Ethan Cross ran and kept counting to 12 and thought about a suppressed shot from a rooftop half a mile away that had hit a man in a doorway with the kind of precision that didn't come from training alone. It came from something older than training. It came from understanding a thing so completely that the calculation became automatic. He'd had that relationship with certain kinds of decisions, the kind you make so fast that they feel like reflex, but underneath them is a decade of compressed experience that your conscious mind never has to touch anymore. Whoever was on that rooftop had been watching this longer than they'd been in the building, longer than the mission had been running, maybe longer than Ethan wanted to think about right now while he was still running for his life. Cap. Mun. Slightly winded, slightly louder than usual. 12 o'clock, 300 meters. Ethan looked. 2 helicopters were coming in low over the rooftops, running dark. No navigation lights, no searchlights. The particular absence of illumination that meant someone had made a decision to move without announcing the movement. They were coming in below the building line using the urban profile as a visual screen, which was technically difficult and operationally aggressive, and said something specific about the pilots and about whoever had scrambled them back from wherever they'd been recalled to. They came down in the open ground of a bombed-out block that had been a city square once, Veldmark Square, where the old fountain still stood half-collapsed in the center, where children had thrown snowballs once, and photographs still existed to prove it. The rotors kicked up snow in white spirals that caught the ambient glow of the Christmas lights and turned briefly iridescent before the downwash flattened them. Ethan's team hit the square at a run and didn't stop running until they were loading through the helicopter doors, counting off by touch. Hand on the next person's shoulder, 1, 2, 3. Rains, Munn, Hatch, Kessler, all of them, all 12, the math coming out the only way he'd been willing to let it come out. He was the last one in. The helicopter was already lifting before the door was fully closed. Through the window, as they banked west over the ruined city, Ethan Cross looked back at the roof lines of Ravenport one more time, at the geometry of buildings and distances, at the sight lines that would have been available to someone positioned at elevation in the northeastern quadrant. He found the building. He was almost certain he found the right one. 6 stories, residential, dark windows, the particular silhouette that matched the angles of the shots he'd heard. There was nothing on the roof, no shape, no movement. Whoever had been there was already gone. The helicopter banked hard left and the city disappeared behind them, replaced by the dark geometry of countryside and the particular silence that comes after the kind of noise that leaves marks you won't fully feel until morning. Munn was slumped against the fuselage with his eyes closed, not sleeping, just somewhere behind his eyelids where things were quieter. Rains was staring at her hands. Hatch had his head back and was looking at the ceiling with an expression that was not quite relief and not quite anything else yet. It was the face of someone who hadn't caught up to the fact that they were still alive. Ethan sat with the question that had no answer yet, the one that was going to stay unanswered until someone decided to give it one, or until he found it himself, which was probably what was going to happen given how tonight had gone. 18 rounds, 12 lives, 90 seconds. Someone had done that math and decided it was worth doing. Had climbed onto a frozen rooftop alone in the dark and looked through a scope at 40 armed men and decided that the right number was 12. Had chosen their future over their own. He looked out the window at the dark countryside moving beneath them, at the absence of the city, at the clean black sky where stars were visible now that the building lights were gone. He thought about new hinges on a door, about pigeons that weren't there, about details that told you the truth before the situation did. He thought about whoever had been on that rooftop, and he started very quietly to ask the right questions. The right questions, it turned out, had very specific answers. It just took 48 hours and a brigadier general willing to look at a map before anyone started giving them. The base they landed at was a forward operating facility 3 hours west of Ravenport, a converted industrial complex that smelled like diesel fuel and institutional coffee, and the particular staleness of a building that never fully aired out because the windows were always blacked out. They'd been on the ground for maybe 20 minutes when the debrief started, and it had the quality of something that had been organized very quickly by people who were still deciding, in real time, how much of the truth they wanted on the record. Ethan sat across a metal table from a man named Colonel Tessler, a logistics officer from the regional command structure who had the soft hands and careful diction of someone who'd spent most of his career inside buildings like this one, rather than outside buildings like the Heysel. Tessler had a yellow legal pad in front of him, and a pen he kept clicking, and he asked his questions in the measured cadence of someone following a prepared list. At any point during the engagement, did you identify the individual providing suppressive fire from the elevated position? No. At any point, did you receive communication from that individual? No. Can you characterize the nature of the fire support in terms of coordination? Were you directing it? Ethan looked at him. I didn't have contact with whoever it was. They were working independently. So you have no knowledge of their identity, their chain of command, or their authorization to operate in that sector. That's correct. Tesler made a note. And you'd describe the support as effective? The word landed wrong. Ethan felt the wrongness of it the way you feel a bad step on dark stairs, a lurch, a catch, an instinct that something structural isn't where it's supposed to be. Effective. Like he was rating a piece of equipment. 12 people are alive, Ethan said. That's my characterization. Tesler nodded and made another note and moved on to the next question on his list. And Ethan answered the rest of them with the mechanical accuracy of a man who understood that this particular conversation was not about finding out what happened. It was about deciding what the official version of what happened was going to be. Those were different things, and Tesler's yellow legal pad was going to be a lot more relevant to the second one than to the first. After the debrief, Rains found him in the corridor outside. They're not looking for her, she said. I know. I mean, they're actively not looking. Tesler's report is going to describe the support fire as unidentified third-party interference and move on. I know, Carla. She studied him. That bothers you. It wasn't a question. He didn't answer it like one. I'm going to find out who it was. And then what? He thought about that for a moment. About suppressed shots in cold air. About corridors carved through 40 armed men with 18 rounds. About the way the firing had moved, systematically, economically, never wasted, like watching someone do something they had done so many times that it had become a different category of action altogether. I don't know yet, he said, but I'm going to start with who had the operational profile for that position and the access to know we were going to be in that building last night. Rains was quiet for a second. That's a short list. Yeah. And most of the people on it are sitting in command posts right now writing their own versions of last night. Yeah, Ethan said again. I know. It took him 14 hours, 3 conversations he wasn't technically authorized to have, and 1 database query run by a signals specialist who owed him a significant favor from an operation in Kandahar that had also never officially happened. The name came back. Lena Mercer. Staff Sergeant, Special Operations Command, Reconnaissance and Long-Range Fires. 11 years of service. Deployment record that read like a tour of every ugly corner of every ugly conflict the last decade had produced. Qualified on 7 different precision rifle platforms. Qualified as a Joint Terminal Attack Controller. 2 commendations for valor, 1 for actions in a situation whose details were still classified at a level Ethan couldn't access without making phone calls that would get noticed. And at the bottom of the service record, the thing that explained everything and nothing simultaneously. Status: suspended. Pending court-martial review. Charges: insubordination, conduct unbecoming, failure to follow lawful orders. He read the charge sheet 3 times. The incident had occurred 6 weeks earlier, on a different operation in a different sector. The details were thin on paper, but the shape was clear enough. Mercer had been operating as overwatch on a raid, had been ordered to hold her fire during a developing hostage situation, and had instead taken 2 shots that, according to the official record, had interfered with ongoing negotiations. According to the official record. He thought about what that phrase usually meant when you saw it in a charge sheet. He thought about what interfered with ongoing negotiations meant when the person using it was someone who hadn't been in the room where the negotiations were happening, or on the roof where the scope was pointed. He pulled the incident report. It took another 2 hours to get clearance and another hour to read through the bureaucratic language until the actual sequence of events emerged. When it did, the picture was clear and ugly, and not at all surprising given what he'd watched through a night vision scope from a helicopter window 12 hours ago. Mercer had been overwatch on a hostage rescue. Command had ordered her to hold fire while they pursued a negotiated release. She had fired twice, killing 2 individuals who were, her own stated assessment, in the process of executing the hostages regardless of any negotiated outcome. The hostages had survived. The two shooters had not. The negotiations, which Mercer had assessed as theater for the benefit of the command structure rather than a genuine pathway to resolution, had been rendered moot, and for that she was facing court-martial, for being right in a way that made the institution uncomfortable. He closed the file, sat for a moment in the small room they'd given him, a converted office with a cot and a window that looked at another building, and thought about the service record of a woman who had been trained to see at distances that exceeded normal human vision and who seemed to have applied that ability to situations as well as targets. He picked up his phone, made a call. "I need to talk to whoever has custody of Staff Sergeant Lena Mercer," he said. "Tell them Captain Ethan Cross, Ghost Element, is requesting a meeting. Tell them it's not a request." They met in a room that had no windows and one door and a table that had been there longer than anyone currently using the building. Lena Mercer was already sitting when they brought him in, not because she'd been there first, but because she'd been held in the facility for 6 days pending her hearing, and she'd adopted the particular stillness of someone who had made peace with waiting. She was 34 years old, looked maybe 38, with the kind of face that had been lived in hard, dark eyes, a small scar along the left jaw that looked like a ricochet burn. Her hands were on the table and she was not fidgeting. She looked at him when he came in and said nothing. He sat down across from her. A guard outside the door. No recorder running. He'd checked. He'd also made sure to have that conversation with the MP sergeant outside before entering, in terms specific enough that there was no ambiguity about what he was asking for. "You know who I am," he said. "Ghost Actual." Her voice was even, not flat. There was something in it, a timbre, but it was controlled in the same way everything else about her was controlled. "Captain Ethan Cross, 12-man Special Operations Element, Ravenport last night. How long were you watching before we went in?" She tilted her head slightly, not evasion, consideration. "From the time your team staged, about 90 minutes before initial breach. And you knew it was a trap." "Not immediately. I suspected it. The vehicle patterns in the approach corridors were wrong. Too organized for a militia operation on a holiday. And the thermal picture from my position showed more signatures than your command feed was reporting, which meant either the drone was malfunctioning or someone had moved assets into the building after the last ISR pass and before your team launched." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Did you report that?" Something moved across her face. Not anger. Something more tired than anger. "I reported it through proper channels at 21:40 hours. I was informed that command was satisfied with their intelligence picture and that I was reminded of my suspended status and told that my presence in the operational area was unauthorized. So they knew. They knew what I told them. Whether they acted on it is a different question." He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back without discomfort, without performance. The quality of someone who had been looked at and assessed and judged many times and had stopped adjusting herself to make it easier for the people doing it. "You had one magazine, SM," he said. 18 rounds. And you chose to engage 40 armed personnel with 18 rounds. I chose to improve the odds for 12 people who were about to be executed by a command structure that had already written them off." A pause. Very small. "That's a different framing." "Walk me through it, the shot selection." She looked at him for a moment as if measuring something. Then she put her hands flat on the table. "First priority was the command element. The man at the stairwell door was directing the internal assault. Remove him, and you slow the decision cycle by 30 to 60 seconds. The people behind him have to figure out the new command structure before they move. That bought your team their first window." She spoke without effect, the way a surgeon might describe a procedure. Not cold, clinical. There was a difference. Second priority was the breach element at the south approach. They had a vehicle-mounted ram 2 blocks out. If they completed the breach while the internal assault was developing, you'd have had 2 simultaneous kill zones with no viable cover. I took the 2 men managing the vehicle approach and their radio operator. 3 shots. 3 shots. The radio operator was the important one. Cut communications between the breach element and the main command. They can't coordinate timing. They become separate problems instead of one combined problem. Then you moved. Then I moved. Every time I changed position, I changed the apparent source of fire. Multiple positions in a short window creates the impression of multiple shooters, which forces a defensive reorientation. Instead of pressing the assault, they start worrying about their own flanks. She paused. It's not a new technique. No, Ethan said, but doing it alone at those ranges in those conditions with 18 rounds is. She didn't respond to that. Didn't look away either. How many shots did you fire total? He asked. 15. 15 out of 18. I stopped when I confirmed your team had cleared the corridor. There was no target requirement after that. Firing additional rounds would have been wasted ammunition and unnecessary risk. She said it simply, without any quality of virtue, just the logic of the thing. He sat with that for a moment. 3 rounds left in the magazine, not because she'd run out, because she'd stopped when the job was done. Your hearing is in 4 days, he said. I'm aware. They're going to convict you. I know that too. The charge sheet is constructed to convict. The incident they're citing, I know what the incident they're citing looks like on paper. Her voice didn't change, didn't harden. The steadiness was worse, somehow, than anger would have been. I also know what it looked like through a scope. Those 2 individuals were not negotiating. They had already made their decision. The command structure chose to believe otherwise because believing otherwise was politically convenient, and the hostages are alive because I disagreed. A breath. None of that changes what the paper says. What if someone changed the paper? For the first time, something shifted in her expression. Not hope. She was too careful for hope, or too experienced, which sometimes amounted to the same thing. Just attention. A focusing. What does that mean? She said. It means I have 12 people who are alive because of what you did last night, and I have a problem with a system that's about to punish you for doing it, and I have enough documented record of what happened at that building to make the official version of events very uncomfortable for some people who would rather it stayed comfortable. She looked at him for a long time. You're going to make noise, she said. I'm going to make a lot of noise. That's going to cost you. Probably. They'll reassign you, restrict your clearances, find something to put on your record. Maybe. Captain. Her voice hadn't changed. But the way she said the rank was different from how she'd said it at the start of the conversation. Less like a designation, more like a name. I've been fighting this institution for 6 years. I know how it retaliates. I know what it costs people who push against it. I'm not going to let you destroy your career over... You saved 12 lives, he said. She stopped. Last night. Alone. With equipment they'd already tried to take from you and orders they expected you to follow and a court-martial waiting for you when you got back. You climbed onto a frozen roof in minus 14 degrees and you took 15 shots and you brought 12 people home that command had already written off. He leaned forward slightly. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it because the record should say what actually happened. Because there are 12 families who would have gotten a phone call this morning, and instead they got to watch their people walk through the door. Because that means something, and it gets to be true somewhere, even if it's inconvenient. Lena Mercer looked at the table, just for a second. When she looked back up, her face was the same, controlled, precise, the face she'd been wearing since he walked in. But something behind the eyes was different in a way he couldn't fully name. Like a window that had been latched from the inside for a long time and had moved a fraction of an inch. They're not going to make it easy, she said. I know. The people who made the decision to recall extraction, they have rank and they have institutional protection, and they do not like being made to look at what they did. I know that too. She was quiet. Then, what do you need from me? Your account of last night. Everything. Time-stamped. Detailed. Your position, your shot selection, your reasoning, your communications attempts before you went up on that roof. Everything that happened in sequence, in your words. That's a confession. It's a testimony. He met her eyes. There's a difference. She considered that for a long moment. Outside the door, somewhere in the corridor, a radio crackled with a weather report. Snow moving in from the northeast, temperatures dropping through the night. The world going about the business of being cold. All right, Lena Mercer said. What happened over the next 72 hours was not dramatic in the way of gunfights or rooftop shots or corridors carved through enemy lines at midnight. It was dramatic in the slower, grinding way of institutions being forced to look at themselves, which was a different kind of violence and in some ways worse because it left marks on people who'd never held a rifle. Ethan Cross filed his own account, a formal after-action statement, 7 pages, signed and submitted through every proper channel simultaneously so that no single person could intercept and redirect it. He documented what he'd heard on the radio before the helicopters were recalled. He documented what he'd observed from the exfil vehicle, the shot patterns, the positions, the systematic nature of the fire support. He documented the corridor that had opened in the circle and the timing of its appearance relative to each shot. He documented 15 minutes of a mission that command had tried to describe as unidentified third-party interference. He submitted it at 0600 hours on Christmas Day. By 0800, his CO had called him. "What the hell are you doing, Cross?" Submitting an accurate after-action report. "This is going to step on a lot of toes." The toes it's going to step on belong to people who recalled extraction on 12 operators in a surrounded building. A silence on the line, long enough that Ethan had time to consider what was coming next. "This is going to reflect on your record." "I know." "Your promotion cycle, Colonel. 12 people had Christmas with their families this morning because of what Lena Mercer did on that roof, and she is currently sitting in a holding facility facing court-martial." "I don't know how to have a conversation about my promotion cycle in the same sentence as that." Another silence. Different quality this time. "You're sure about this?" "Yes, sir." His CO exhaled, a long, slow exhalation that carried with it the weight of a career's worth of navigating exactly this kind of institutional current, knowing where the rocks were, knowing how to move around them, having the experience to know when someone had made up their mind, and further discussion was form rather than function. "Get me your full documentation package," he said. "Everything. It's already in your inbox." A pause. Then something that might have been, in another context, a laugh. "Of course it is." By the following afternoon, 10 of Ethan's 11 surviving teammates had submitted their own statements. The 11th, Specialist Burns, who was dealing with something personal at home that had nothing to do with any of this, submitted his 48 hours later, which put the complete set of 12 testimonies, plus Ethan's command-level statement, plus Lena's own detailed account, into the formal record within 72 hours of the event. What those documents collectively described was not a story about insubordination. They described a systematic command failure, the decision to proceed with inadequate intelligence, the recall of extraction assets under political pressure, the abandonment of 12 personnel in an active combat zone. And then they described in precise and consistent detail the actions of one individual who had recognized the failure and responded to it at personal cost and professional risk with a clarity of purpose and a level of skill that none of the 12 men who'd been inside that building were going to minimize or mischaracterize on paper. The documents also made a secondary thing visible: the pattern. This was not the first time command decisions in Ravenport's operational sector had prioritized political optics over operational reality. The previous incident, the one that had generated Mercer's original charge sheet, had the same structure: convenient intelligence picture, misaligned command assessment, pressure applied to suppress the accurate report of someone who'd had eyes on the actual situation. The second incident being on the record, adjacent to the first, in the statements of 12 credible witnesses, was the thing that made it impossible to manage quietly. Ethan didn't know that was going to happen when he filed his statement. He had not constructed it as a strategic document. He had written what he knew, in sequence, without embellishment, and then he had signed it and submitted it because that was what the record required. The strategic implications were something he found out about later, through channels, in the way you found out about the effects of things you set in motion, after the motion had already started. What he found out was that 3 levels above Colonel Tesler and his yellow legal pad, someone with enough rank to matter had read the accumulated documentation and made a call that Ethan Cross would not learn the details of until much later. What he learned at the time was the effect. Lena Mercer's court-martial was suspended pending review. and the review had been assigned to an investigative body that operated outside the regional command structure that had generated the original charges. He found out about it at 2200 hours on December 27th, sitting in the same converted office with the cot and the blacked-out window, reading a message on a screen that used bureaucratic language to describe something that was, underneath the language, the first indication that the thing he'd set in motion was moving in a direction he hadn't been certain it could move. He read the message twice. Then he walked down the corridor to the small common area where Munn was eating something out of a plastic container that didn't look particularly festive and watching a television mounted high on the wall with the sound turned down. "Hey," Ethan said. Munn looked at him, looked at whatever was on Ethan's face. "Put down the plastic container." "What happened?" "The review board on Mercer's case has been reassigned." Munn was quiet for a moment. "That's good." "Yeah. Is it going to be enough?" Ethan thought about that, about institutional systems and the particular way they moved, slowly, with friction, with the internal resistance of structures that were designed to protect themselves. About the fact that reassigning a review board was not the same as overturning a charge, was not the same as restoring a record, was not the same as acknowledging publicly that a woman who had saved 12 lives was being punished for it. "I don't know," he said, honestly. "But it's a start." Munn picked up his food again, looked at the television. Then, "We should probably find out who she is, properly, as a team. I know where she is. Then we should go." Ethan looked at his teammate, at the wedding ring, at the lines, at the man who had run through a burning intersection 3 nights ago because Ethan had said to run, and that had been enough. "Yeah," he said. "We should." He turned and walked back down the corridor. The blacked-out windows gave nothing away. Outside, somewhere beyond the facility walls, Ravenport was still burning in the low, steady way of cities that had been burning too long to be dramatic about it anymore. But the helicopters had landed. The team was intact. And in a holding room 2 corridors away, Lena Mercer was sitting with the stillness of someone who had learned how to wait, and who had not yet been told that 12 men had spent the last 3 days making sure that waiting was the last thing she was ever going to have to do alone. The holding room was at the end of a corridor that smelled like floor wax and recycled air, and Lena Mercer was sitting exactly where Ethan had left her 6 hours earlier. Same chair, same posture, hands flat on the table, the stillness of someone who had made an internal decision about how to spend the hours they couldn't control. A paperback book sat on the table beside her right hand, face down, spine cracked at roughly the halfway point. She hadn't been reading it when they came in. Ethan suspected she hadn't been reading it for a while. She looked up when the door opened. First at Ethan, then at Munn, who filled the doorframe in a way that was architectural rather than intentional. Then at the 8 other members of Ghost Team, who arranged themselves in the small room with the practiced efficiency of people accustomed to fitting into spaces that weren't designed for them. Not all 12. Burns was still handling the personal situation. Kessler had a phone call with his wife that had been delayed 3 days. But 10 of them were there, in various states of off-duty presentability. Some in PT gear, some still in parts of their operational kit because nobody had fully transitioned out of the operational mindset yet, which took longer than people thought and longer than the institution acknowledged. Lena looked at them. She said nothing for a moment. Then, "This is either very good or very bad." "The review board on your case was reassigned," Ethan said, "external to the regional command structure." She absorbed that. Her expression didn't shift the way relief shifts a face. It was more subtle than that, more internal, the kind of adjustment that happens when a person who has been bracing for impact recalibrates without fully relaxing. "How did that happen?" she said. Ethan glanced at Munn. Munn looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man who had nothing to do with anything. 12 statements, Ethan said, plus yours, plus documentation of the original command decisions on both incidents. You filed all of that. We filed all of that. She looked at the 10 men standing in a room that wasn't big enough for 10 men. There was something working behind her eyes that wasn't quite readable. Something that was processing the fact of them being there, the fact of the effort, the weight of it, in real time. "That's going to cost some of you," she said. "Probably," Munn said. "I'm not—" She stopped herself, restarted. "I didn't ask for this. We know, Ethan said. We're not doing it because you asked. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up the paperback book from the table, closed it properly this time, and set it back down. A small thing. The kind of gesture that doesn't mean what it looks like it means. It was just something for her hands to do while the rest of her caught up to the moment. What happens now? She said. The review board convenes in 10 days. You'll need a formal legal representative and a documented account of both incidents in your own words. You've already started the second part. He paused. The first part, I know someone. A JAG officer? A very good JAG officer who owes me a favor and who has a particular interest in command accountability cases. She considered that. And if the board upholds the original charges anyway, then we go up another level. He said it without drama, just the fact of it. She studied him the way she'd been studying him since the first conversation, with the careful attention of someone who had learned that people who offered things usually had a version of the cost they hadn't fully disclosed. Not suspicion exactly, just accuracy. The habit of a person who had been wrong about people before and had paid for it. Why? She said. Just that. Ethan thought about the honest answer versus the clean answer. He gave her the honest one. Because I've been in this uniform for 12 years, and I have spent most of those 12 years watching the institution make the right noises about the right things, and then do the opposite when it costs something. And I'm tired of it. And you handed me a reason to stop being tired and start being loud, and I'm taking it. A pause. Also, you saved my team. That's not a small thing to me. The room was quiet enough that the ventilation system was audible. A low, constant breath. Okay, Lena Mercer said. The review board convened not in 10 days, but in 7, which Ethan found out later was because the documentation package had reached someone at a level high enough that the normal institutional pace had been overridden by the institutional instinct to get ahead of something before it became visible to people outside the institution. There was a difference between managing a problem and solving it, and the difference mattered enormously in terms of what the outcome looked like on paper. He found out about the accelerated timeline the same way he found out about most things in the last week, through his CO, who called him at 0700 on December 30th with the tone of a man delivering information he'd received recently and was still orienting to himself. The board meets January 2nd, Colonel Renner said. Closed session. Full documentation package has been entered into the record. Mercer will have JAG representation. Who's presiding? A pause. Brigadier General Adrian Holt. Ethan didn't say anything immediately. He was standing at the blacked-out window of the converted office, looking at his own reflection in the dark glass. Hollow, indistinct, the shape of a man rather than the man. Holt, he said. You know him? I know of him. Ravenport Sector Command. He was in the chain that recalled extraction. Another pause from Renner. Longer. Yes, he was. Is that a conflict of interest? That, Renner said carefully, is going to depend very much on what happens in the room on January 2nd. Bond. Brigadier General Adrian Holt was 61 years old and looked 55 in good light and 68 in bad light, and the light in the review boardroom on the morning of January 2nd was the fluorescent flat of an institutional space that was not interested in making anyone look good. He was already at the head of the table when Ethan arrived, seated, hands folded, in the dress uniform he'd clearly worn for the occasion, with the particular bearing of a man who had spent 4 decades deciding what kind of officer he was and had arrived at an answer he was not entirely comfortable with. There were 3 other board members, 2 colonels and a JAG colonel named Pressman, who had the kind of face that had heard everything and retained a professional skepticism about all of it. Lena Mercer sat to Ethan's left with her JAG representative, a young captain named Doyle who had been recommended by Ethan's contact and who had prepared for this with the obsessive thoroughness of someone who understood that the case was not just about one person's record. Tesler was also in the room, not at the table, off to the side with his yellow legal pad, the institutional memory of the process that had generated the original charges. He had the look of a man who was not certain which direction the current was running today and was reserving his weight accordingly. Holt opened the session with the formal language of the process, dates, charge references, documentation numbers, and then he looked up from his papers. "Staff Sergeant Mercer," he said, "the charges before this board relate to two separate incidents of alleged insubordination and failure to follow lawful orders. The board has reviewed all submitted documentation. We will now hear direct testimony, beginning with the command account of the December 24th incident." He looked at Tesler. "Colonel," Tesler cleared his throat. He read from his notes, the version of December 24th that lived in the official record: unidentified third-party interference, unauthorized operation in the sector, actions taken without command authorization that could have compromised ongoing operational security. When he finished, Holt looked at Ethan. "Captain Cross, your statement describes a materially different sequence of events." "Yes, sir." "Walk the board through your account." Ethan did. He had told this story enough times in the last week that he knew which parts needed more space and which parts could be compressed, and he gave the board a version that was complete without being theatrical. The trap, the recall, the suppressed shots, the corridor, the extraction. He spoke for 11 minutes without notes. When he finished, the room was quiet in a way that was different from the quiet at the beginning. One of the colonels, a woman named Voss, logistics, with the careful diction of someone who measured words before spending them, leaned forward slightly. "Captain Cross, you've described a command decision to recall extraction as the precipitating factor in Staff Sergeant Mercer's involvement. Is it your testimony that the recall decision was made without operational justification?" "It's my testimony that 12 personnel were surrounded and undergunned in an active combat zone, and the extraction assets were recalled in a time window that would have resulted in their deaths without outside intervention. Whether the decision had a justification that I wasn't party to, that's a question for the people who made it." Voss looked at Holt. Holt had not moved since Ethan began speaking. He was still in the same position, hands folded, posture correct. But something about the quality of his stillness had changed. It was the stillness of a man holding something rather than the stillness of a man waiting. "Staff Sergeant Mercer," Holt said. Lena looked at him. "The board has reviewed your written account of both incidents. I have specific questions about the September 14th incident, the one that generated the original charges." He paused. "Your stated assessment at the time was that the two individuals you engaged were in the process of executing the hostages regardless of the negotiated outcome. Walk the board through that assessment." Lena glanced at Doyle. Doyle gave a small nod. "Proceed." She turned to the board. "At 22:47 hours on September 14th, I was in the overwatch position designated Bravo, with a clear line of sight to the interior of the target structure through a compromised window on the north face. The two individuals in question had been in contact with the command negotiator by radio for approximately 40 minutes. During that period, I observed the following." She didn't use notes either. At 22:31, the senior individual, the one designated as the primary negotiator on the hostile side, gave a hand signal to his partner that was inconsistent with any posture of genuine negotiation. It was a military hand signal. Specifically, it was a confirmation signal. The kind used to confirm a timed action was on schedule. At 22:39, the partner moved the two hostages from their original position against the east wall to a position near the south wall. The south wall has a drain channel running along its base. It is a surface that is easier to clean. She stopped for exactly 1 second. At 2244, I reported both observations to command and requested permission to engage. I was told to hold and that negotiations were progressing. At 2247, the senior individual raised his weapon. I fired twice. The room held that. Voss spoke first. "The command log from that incident indicates your observations were reported but assessed as inconclusive." "Yes, ma'am, that's what the log says." "And you disagree with that assessment?" "The hostages are alive," Lena said. "I disagree with describing that as inconclusive." Doyle put a hand lightly on her arm. A small gesture. She registered it. adjusted. With respect to the board, Doyle said, his voice carrying the particular precision of someone who had been in rooms like this many times and knew what they required. The documentation submitted includes communications intercepts from the September 14th operation, obtained through proper signals intelligence channels, that support Staff Sergeant Mercer's assessment of hostile intent. Specifically, intercepted communications from 1 hour prior to the incident indicate the hostile party had no intention of releasing the hostages regardless of negotiated outcome. That intelligence was available at the command level at the time Staff Sergeant Mercer was ordered to hold fire. Tesler moved on his chair, not dramatically, just the subtle shift of a man whose comfort had changed. Voss looked at Holt. Pressman, the JAG colonel, had been writing steadily since the session began. He stopped writing and looked at Holt. Holt unfolded his hands. He picked up a document from the stack in front of him, set it down, picked up a different one. Ethan watched him do this without the performance of watching, peripheral, steady, the same way he watched a room that might or might not have something in it. "I want to address something," Holt said. His voice had changed, not dramatically, a register shift, a texture, the kind of change that happens when someone stops managing a conversation and starts having one. "The documentation before this board includes my own communications from the night of December 24th, specifically my authorization of the extraction recall." Nobody in the room moved. "I was operating under pressure from above my position that I did not disclose to the personnel in the field. That pressure was political in nature. It related to ongoing diplomatic considerations in the Ravenport sector that I was not in a position to override unilaterally." He paused. "I believed at the time that the situation would resolve without extraction. I was wrong, and I want that on the record, said clearly, before this board proceeds any further." Tesler's pen had stopped moving. Doyle had stopped writing. Even Pressman had gone still, which for a JAG colonel who had heard everything was the most significant stillness in the room. Lena was looking at Holt. Her face was neutral in the particular way of someone who is listening very hard and not allowing the listening to show. "General Holt," Pressman said carefully, "are you submitting this as formal testimony?" "I am." "You understand that testimony submitted to this board becomes part of the permanent record and may be referred to other investigative bodies?" "I understand." "And you're prepared?" "Colonel Pressman." Holt's voice was quiet, not sharp, quiet in the way of someone who has made a decision and doesn't need to defend it. "I have been in this uniform for 40 years. I have made decisions in those 40 years that I am proud of, and decisions I am not. The decision I made on December 24th is in the second category. I would like the record to reflect that accurately, and then I would like this board to do its job." He looked at Lena. "Sergeant Mercer saved 12 lives by doing exactly what her training, her judgment, and her conscience required her to do. The fact that I failed those same 12 people the same night is not unrelated to the charge before this board." The room sat with that. Voss and the second colonel exchanged a look, not a conspiratorial look, the look of two people recalibrating simultaneously. Ethan Cross sat very still in his chair and thought about the nature of institutions, how they were made of people, ultimately, all the way down, and how occasionally one of those people surprised you in a direction you hadn't expected. He had not expected Holt to do that. He had prepared for a different kind of general, the kind who managed, who deflected, who traded in the particular currency of institutional language that meant nothing while sounding like it meant everything. Holt was something else. Ethan was still figuring out what. The board recessed at 11:30 and reconvened at 1400. In the interim, Ethan and Lena sat in a small anteroom with bad coffee and a window that looked at a parking lot. Doyle was on his phone. Munn had appeared at some point. Nobody had told him the timing, which meant either he'd asked someone or he'd simply decided to be present until he had a reason not to be, which was very Munn. Lena held her coffee cup with both hands. She hadn't drunk any of it. It was just something to hold. "Holt's testimony," she said. Not a full sentence, just the beginning of a thought she was working through. "Yeah," Ethan said. "I didn't expect that." "Neither did I." "Is it going to be enough?" He thought about the honest answer again. "I think it changes the weight distribution." The board was looking at a case where command was unified in one direction. Now they're looking at a case where the officer who made the most significant command decision that night has offered his own account of its inadequacy. A pause. Pressman looked interested in a specific way. What way? The way JAG colonels look when they're calculating the downstream effects of a document entering the formal record. She was quiet for a moment. Then, he said it could be referred to other investigative bodies. Yes. Holt knew that before he said it. Yes. She turned the coffee cup in her hands. He's falling on it. He's correcting it, Ethan said. There's a difference. She considered that. Whether she accepted the distinction or not, he couldn't tell. The September incident, she said after a while. The intercepts Doyle submitted. I didn't know those existed. They've been in the Signals archive since the night of the operation. Someone chose not to include them in the original charge documentation. She absorbed that slowly. The way you absorb something that you already half knew, but hoped wasn't exactly the shape it turned out to be. Tesler, she said. Tesler compiled the original package. So he knew. I think he knew what was in the archive and chose what to include. That's not... She stopped. Started over. That's not a small thing. No, it's not. She set the coffee cup down on the table beside her, looked at it, looked at the parking lot through the window. A gray sky. The kind of flat winter light that made everything look temporary. If Pressman refers it, she said, it goes above Holt. Yes. That's going to be ugly. Yes. For a lot of people. Yes. He looked at her. You okay with that? She took a second with the question. It was the first time he'd asked her something like that directly. Not about testimony or strategy or process, but about her. The actual person sitting in the chair. I've been in this for 6 weeks, she said. Suspended. Waiting for a hearing that I was pretty sure was going to end one way. I've had a lot of time to think about what I'm okay with. She looked at him. I fired those shots because I assessed that not firing them would result in the deaths of people I could protect. Both times. And I would do it again. Whether I'm okay with the consequences of being honest about that? Yeah, I think I am. Even if it costs you the career? It already cost me the career. What I'm finding out now is whether it's going to cost me the record too. She paused. That matters. Not for me. For the next person who's in that position. If the record says I was wrong, then the next person in that position takes that into account and hesitates. And hesitation at the wrong moment. People die, Ethan said. People die, she agreed. The board reconvened at 1400 and the session lasted 40 minutes. Ethan had been in enough proceedings to read the room by the way people sat down rather than by what they said, and when the board members came back in, Voss sat with a different posture, something resolved rather than deliberating. Pressman had a second legal pad now, which he hadn't had before the recess, which meant he had started a separate set of notes during the break that were not part of the primary record. Holt spoke first. This board has reviewed the documentation in full and has heard testimony from all relevant parties. Regarding the charges of insubordination and failure to follow lawful orders stemming from the December 24th incident, this board finds insufficient basis to sustain those charges, given the documentation of command failure that directly precipitated the unauthorized action and the documented outcome, the preservation of 12 personnel who would otherwise have been lost. He spoke without inflection, the way people speak when they have decided on exact words and want them exact. Regarding the September 14th charges, this board finds that the submission of signals intelligence intercepts not included in the original charge. Documentation constitutes a material irregularity in the proceedings that requires referral for separate investigation. These charges are suspended pending that investigation. Suspended. Not dismissed. Suspended. Doyle leaned toward Lena and said something low. She nodded once. Staff Sergeant Mercer. Holt looked at her directly. The board is aware that the suspension of charges is not a complete resolution of the record. The referral for investigation of the September 14th documentation irregularities will take time. We cannot restore what has already been disrupted in your service record today. What we can do is formally note, in the record of these proceedings, that the actions described in both incidents, whatever their characterization under the charge framework, resulted in outcomes that preserved human life in circumstances where command judgment had failed to do so. He paused. That notation will be attached to your file. The room was quiet. Then Lena said, "Thank you, sir." Not warm, not cold. The correct words said correctly by a person who was still processing what they meant. Holt nodded. He closed the folder in front of him with the particular finality of a man putting something down that he'd been carrying. Session concluded. Outside the building, the January air was brutal, the kind of cold that had no ambiguity about what it was. Ethan and Lena stood on the steps while Doyle dealt with paperwork inside, and Munn stood 20 feet away pretending to look at something on his phone, which meant he was giving them space while staying in range, which was a very Munn thing to do. "Suspended, not dismissed," Lena said. "For now. The investigation into the documentation irregularities is going to take months. Probably. I'm still technically suspended from active duty pending the outcome." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. The cold pushed at both of them, and neither of them moved. "But Holt's testimony is in the record," she said. "Yes. And the intercepts. And 12 statements from Ghost Team, and Holt referred himself for investigation. His testimony contained enough self-implication that the referral was automatic. She processed that. He's going to lose his stars." Ethan thought about that, about a man in a dress uniform who had spent 40 years in an institution and had sat at the head of a table and chosen accuracy over protection. It wasn't absolution. One honest statement didn't cancel the decision that had nearly killed 12 people. But it was something, a specific kind of something that Ethan was still finding the right word for. "He might," Ethan said. That was his choice. Lena looked out at the parking lot, the same gray sky she'd been looking at from the inside, now overhead and actual. She breathed in cold air and let it out in a visible cloud. "What do I do now?" she said. Not helpless, practical. She was a practical person. It was just a question that currently had no clean answer, and she was acknowledging that out loud. Right now? Nothing. Doyle will manage the investigation timeline. The record notation means your file doesn't say what it said this morning. That's real, even if it's not complete. He paused. "After that, I'm not going back," she said, quiet, certain. "Even if they clear everything, I'm not going back to this." He looked at her. He wasn't surprised. He had the sense she'd made that decision before she'd climbed onto the roof of that building, that the act of removing the earpiece had been the act of leaving, in some fundamental sense, even if the paperwork hadn't caught up yet. "Okay," he said. "That doesn't bother you?" "Why would it?" She shrugged slightly. "You're fighting to fix my record so I can stay in a job I just told you I'm leaving. I'm fighting to fix your record so it says the right thing. What you do with your life after that is yours." He looked at her steadily. "You don't owe the institution anything. The institution owes you a record that's accurate. Those are separate debts." She looked at him for a long moment. The cold moved between them. Somewhere across the parking lot a vehicle started, and the sound of it was ordinary and civilian and belonging to a world that was going about its business without reference to any of this. "Okay," she said. And then, because she was not a person who performed emotions for an audience, and because the thing she felt in that moment was too large and too complicated for an adequate word anyway, she just stood there in the cold with her hands in her pockets and let the morning be what it was. Munn walked over. He didn't say anything. He just stood next to both of them and looked at the parking lot and the gray sky and the ordinary world going about its business. After a while he said, "There's bad coffee inside if anyone wants bad coffee." Lena looked at him. "How bad?" "Criminal." She almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the shape a smile makes before it decides whether to commit, but it was something. "Yeah," she said. "Okay." The bad coffee was exactly as bad as Munn had promised. Lena drank it anyway, standing at the small table in the anteroom while Doyle gathered his files, and the building went back to doing whatever buildings like this did when the formal proceedings were over. The fluorescent hum, the recycled air, the sense of institutional machinery continuing its rotation regardless of what had just occurred inside one of its rooms. She finished the cup, set it down, looked at the residue at the bottom, the way you look at things that have served their purpose. Mun was refilling his own cup from the carafe with the expression of a man who knew it was bad and had decided that bad coffee was still coffee. Ethan was leaning against the wall near the door with his arms crossed, not looking at his phone, not looking at anything specific. The posture of someone thinking rather than waiting. "The investigation referral," Lena said. "How long does something like that actually take?" Doyle looked up from his files. "In my experience, months? Could be 6. Could be closer to 9. There are a lot of documents in the chain that will need to be reviewed, and the number of individuals potentially implicated is not small," Ethan said. "Not small," Doyle agreed. He snapped his bag shut. "What I can tell you is that with Holt's testimony in the record, the referral has significant momentum. The investigating body won't be able to treat this as a minor procedural matter. Because Holt isn't a minor procedural matter," Lena said. "Because Holt's testimony directly implicates political pressure from above his level," Doyle said. "Which means the investigation doesn't stop at Holt, it goes up." The room was quiet for a moment with the weight of that specific direction. "How far up?" Munn asked. Doyle looked at him. "That's genuinely not something I can predict. But the documentation package, the intercepts, the communication logs from the night of December 24th, Holt's statement, that's not a package that stops at the first door it hits. It's going to keep moving until it finds the ceiling." He said good morning to each of them with the professional warmth of someone who had done his job well and knew it and didn't need to make a production of it, and then he left. His footsteps diminished down the corridor, and the anteroom was just the 3 of them and the bad coffee and the flat winter light coming through the window. 9 months, Lena said. "Maybe 6, Ethan said. "And in the meantime, I'm technically still suspended." "Technically. But the board's notation is in your file now. Anyone pulling your record sees it before they see the charge status." She thought about that. About the specific order of information, what appeared first, what appeared second, how the sequence shaped the reading. 11 years of a service record, and the thing that would define how it was read going forward had been written in the last 3 hours in a room with bad fluorescent lighting and a general who had chosen accuracy over self-preservation. She wasn't sure yet what to do with that. It was too new, too complicated to have a clean feeling about. "Okay," she said. "Okay." Munn looked at her. "You have somewhere to go?" She blinked. It was such a specific, practical question, and it landed at an angle she hadn't been prepared for. In the 6 weeks since the suspension, she'd been in transit, the facility, a transient officer billet 2 miles from the base, a week in a hotel when the billet was needed for someone else. She had an apartment somewhere that she'd been paying rent on by automatic transfer and hadn't been inside since October. "Yes," she said, "I have an apartment." "Is there food in it?" She looked at him. "I've been here 6 weeks. So no." "Almost certainly no." Munn nodded once. "There's a place 3 kilometers from the main gate that does breakfast until 2 in the afternoon. It's not good exactly, but it's not bad either, which in this context is a significant recommendation." She looked at him for a moment, then at Ethan. Ethan had the expression of someone who was not going to interfere with whatever this was. "Is this the part where you take me to breakfast?" she said. "It's the part where we take you to breakfast," Munn said. "Because we've been eating institutional food for a week, and I personally need something that didn't come out of a warming tray." Hasem. The place was called Marta's, which was not the name of anyone currently associated with it, but had been the name of whoever had started it at some point far enough back that the name had become the place rather than the person. It had 7 tables, a counter with 4 stools, a menu board written in marker on a whiteboard that had been erased and rewritten enough times that you could see the ghost of previous items beneath the current ones. It smelled like bacon grease and coffee that was substantially better than what they'd left behind. They took a table near the window. All 10 members of Ghost Team who had been at the board session were there by the time the food arrived, which meant someone, probably Munn, had sent a message on a group channel at some point between the anteroom and the parking lot. They filled 3 tables pushed together, and the conversation was the loud, overlapping, tangential kind that groups make when the pressure has dropped and the body is trying to remember how to be ordinary. Lena sat at the end of the combined table and let it wash over her. She ate eggs and toast and drank coffee that was actually good and watched 12 men, 11 men, and Burns, who had arrived at some point, apparently the personal situation having resolved, interact in the specific way of people who had been through something together recently enough that it was still present, but far enough back that they could sit down and eat breakfast without it consuming the room. Kessler, across from her, was telling a story about the helicopter landing that she hadn't been there for, and the story was mostly true from what she could tell, but had acquired, in the retelling, a detail involving the fountain in Veldmark Square that she was fairly certain had been embellished. Hatch kept correcting him on timing. Munn was eating methodically, the way Munn seemed to do everything, with complete attention. Ethan was at the other end of the table. He caught her eye once. She nodded, barely, and he looked back at whatever Raines was saying to him. She thought about the roof, about the cold concrete under her elbows, and the particular quality of air at -14, and the way the scope brought the world into a narrow, precise channel where everything outside the reticle stopped being relevant. She had been doing that, entering that channel, living inside the narrow, precise focus of the thing in front of her, for 11 years. It was what she was good at. It was what she'd been trained for, and what she'd refined beyond training into something that lived below conscious calculation. She also thought about what it cost. About the thing you gave up when you spent 11 years narrowing your world to what was inside the scope. About the apartment she hadn't been inside since October. And the automatic rent payments, and the question Munn had asked, is there food in it? And what it said that she hadn't thought about that on her own. The investigation was going to take months. Her record was annotated but not clean. She was suspended from a job she'd already decided to leave, and she was sitting in a breakfast place with 11 people she'd met a week ago who had restructured their professional lives to fight for her record, and the thing she kept coming back to was not gratitude exactly. It was something more disorienting than gratitude, something more like being seen in a way she had not anticipated and had not prepared for, and didn't have a practiced response to. She was working on that when Ethan appeared in the chair next to her. He'd moved without her noticing, which almost never happened. She was tired. It showed in things like that. "You're somewhere else," he said. "I'm here." "Your body is. Where's the rest of you?" She looked at him. "That's a very philosophical question for 9 in the morning." "Humor me." She looked at the table for a moment, at her coffee cup. "I'm thinking about what comes next, not the investigation, the rest of it. The apartment. The apartment, the job, the—" She stopped, found the word. "The structure. The last 11 years had a structure. Even when the structure was broken, it was there. Now it's gone." "Restructuring," she said. "I don't know into what yet." He was quiet for a moment. Down the table, Kessler's fountain story had reached a disputed climax, and at least 4 people were talking at once. The noise was good. It was the right kind of noise for a table of people who had come close enough to the other kind of silence. "You were doing civilian protection work," Ethan said, "before you came back for this deployment." She looked at him. "You read my full file." "I read what I could access. There was a gap between your second and third deployment, about 14 months. NGO affiliation, conflict zone security advisory." "You did read my full file." "I was trying to understand who I was talking to." She absorbed that. It wasn't an apology. He wasn't apologizing for reading it, and she wasn't going to ask him to. It was just information. "South Veldera," she said. "Civilian evacuation support during the corridor conflict. We were moving families out of the contested zones ahead of the advance." A pause. "It was hard. It was not what I trained for. It was also—" She found the word. It felt like the right use of the specific things I know how to do. "Why did you come back?" She picked up her coffee, set it back down without drinking. "Because someone asked me to. And because I thought I could do more good inside the institution than outside it." She looked at the table. "That turned out to be wrong. Or the institution wasn't ready for the kind of good you were doing." She almost smiled. It was closer to a smile than the shape she'd made in the anteroom. "That's a generous interpretation." It's an accurate one. She looked at him directly. At the 12 years in his face, the lines that hadn't been there before those 12 years, the particular way a person looks when they've spent a long time doing something hard and are still deciding whether it was worth it. "What are you going to do?" she said. "Stay in, for now." For now. There's still work that needs doing inside the institution, work that's harder to do from the outside. He paused. "You made it possible for me to see that more clearly. The Holt situation, watching him make that choice in that room, watching what the record can do when the right people insist on it being accurate. That matters. I want to stay and be one of the people who insists." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're going to have a hard career," she said. "Probably. The people Holt's testimony implicates. They're going to know that you're the reason the documentation package exists. Yes, you're comfortable with that. I'm realistic about it." A brief pause. "There's a difference between comfortable and willing. I'm willing." She nodded slowly. Outside the window, a vehicle went past with its windows fogged, carrying someone somewhere on an ordinary January morning that had nothing to do with any of this. The world was very large and very indifferent and went about its business with complete consistency regardless of what happened in review board rooms or on frozen rooftops at midnight. That was the true thing, she thought, not the comforting version of it, the actual true thing. The world went on, and you chose what to put in front of you while it did. The investigation results took 8 months. 8 months during which Lena Mercer's apartment was restocked with food within the first week, because she found that the act of filling a refrigerator was a usefully concrete way of beginning the project of building something. She spent the first 3 weeks doing very little, sleeping, walking, reading books that had nothing to do with military operations or conflict zones or anything that required the narrow, precise focus she'd been living inside for 11 years. She did this consciously, deliberately, the way you rest an overused muscle. Not because the muscle is gone, but because the muscle needs to be something other than the only thing. She called Doyle twice a month for updates. The updates were slow and incremental and described a process that was thorough in the way that processes become thorough when they are being watched carefully by people who cannot afford them to be sloppy. The investigators had gone up through Holt's chain exactly as Doyle had predicted, not stopping at the first door, finding the ceiling. And what they'd found at the ceiling level was the shape of a decision-making pattern that the December 24th incident was only the most recent and most documentable instance of. The communications intercepts from the September 14th operation became the fulcrum. The document that proved Tesler had compiled the original charge package with deliberate omissions, had known about the intercepts and had excluded them, was a specific kind of ugly that the institution found very difficult to manage quietly. It was verifiable. It was dated. It was clear. Tesler resigned his commission in March. Nobody called it that publicly. The official language was transition to civilian sector, which was institutional language for the thing that happened when someone's position became structurally untenable and everyone agreed that a clean exit was preferable to a documented one. Lena heard about it from Doyle in a phone call that lasted 4 minutes, and she sat with the information after the call was over and felt something that was not satisfaction. Satisfaction was too simple for it, but was in the same family of emotions. The recognition that something had been named correctly, finally, in the world. Holt's situation was more complicated and took longer. His rank was reviewed. The political pressure that had come from above his level was documented and entered into the investigative record, which had the effect of distributing the formal accountability upward in ways that were uncomfortable for more than one person who had spent a career being comfortable. Holt himself retired in May. Not pushed out, not quite, but in the specific way of a man who had looked at what he'd done and who he'd become in the doing and had decided that the institution had gotten from him what it was going to get and that he would like to stop now. His retirement papers were filed before the investigation formally concluded. The timing was his, which meant something, even if what it meant was complicated. Ethan called her in April to tell her that the internal investigation had formally expanded to include the political level, that the phrase above Holt's position was now being defined on paper for the first time, which was the institutional equivalent of opening a room that had been closed for a long time and turning a light on in it. "How are you?" he said. "Good," she said. And then because it was true and because she'd learned in the last 4 months that she could say true things without preparing them. Actually good. Yeah? I've been doing consulting work, civilian protection logistics. An organization working the Eastern Corridor, they needed someone who understood the security architecture of the displacement route. A pause. It's the right use of what I know how to do. South Veldaro work. Similar. Different geography, same problem. She paused. It's hard. In the right way. There was a warmth in his voice that didn't announce itself. I'm glad. How are you? He laughed, short and dry. There's a word for my career trajectory right now, but I can't use it in a professional context. Complicated? Complicated is one word. My CO is being very supportive in the specific way people are supportive when supporting you is also the correct institutional position to hold, which means the support is real, but it's also convenient, and I'm trying not to think too hard about which part is driving which. Does it matter? Not really. The work is still the work. Yeah, she said. It is. Skeet. The investigation concluded formally on August 19th. The findings were classified at a level that meant the general public would not read them, but the effects were visible in the way the effects of these things are always visible. In the specific retirements, the specific reassignments, the specific absence of certain names from certain committees and advisory boards. The institution shifted, not dramatically, not all at once. The way large things shift, slowly, with friction, with the internal resistance of structures that are designed to maintain their shape, but shift nonetheless. Lena's record was formally cleared on August 22nd. All charges, both incidents, were expunged. The board's notation remained because she had asked for it to remain. The formal documentation that her actions in both cases had preserved human life in circumstances where command judgment had failed. She had been specific about that with Doyle, and Doyle had been specific with the process. And the process had produced the result because the result was correct and the documentation supported it. Doyle called her to give her the news at 7 in the morning, which suggested he had been watching his inbox and had made the call the moment the document arrived. It's done, he said. She was standing in her kitchen, coffee in hand, looking out the window at a street that was just beginning to show the early signs of morning traffic. An ordinary street in an ordinary city that didn't know anything about review boards or rooftop shots or the specific weight of a document that says formally, in language that cannot be revised, that a person did the right thing. Thank you, she said, for everything. You did the hard parts. We all did the hard parts. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what are you going to do with it? The cleared record? All of it. The cleared record, the 11 years, He paused. All of it. She looked out the window. The street was filling, people going somewhere, carrying things, living the ordinary weight of ordinary days. Keep doing what I'm doing, she said. The corridor work, the displacement protection. I have a team now, 4 people. Contract security advisors, all veterans. We've moved about 1,200 people out of the contested zones in the last 6 months. A pause. It's not clean. Nothing about it is clean, but the right number of them are alive. That sounds like the right use, Doyle said. Yeah, she said. It does. The reunion happened in December. Not planned, not formally, not with invitations or a scheduled time. It was Munn who started it, which surprised nobody who knew Munn. He sent a message to a group channel that had been established in January and used sporadically in the months since, a channel that contained 11 names and 1 name that had been added in February when Ethan had messaged her the invite link with a note that said only, "You should be in here." The message said, December 24th, Marta's, 9 in the morning, if you can make it. That was it. No justification, no explanation of why December 24th, though the date needed no explanation to anyone in the channel. All 12 came. Burns drove 6 hours. Kessler flew in from wherever his wife's family was, wearing the specific expression of a man who had negotiated the logistics of this with someone who loved him and had won the negotiation through a combination of persistence and the fact that she understood, as she had always understood, that some obligations were not optional. Hatch and Rains arrived together from the same regional posting, which suggested their assignment paths had converged in the last year. The others came from wherever they were, carrying the accumulated weight and change of 11 months of living between then and now. Lena arrived last, which was not because she was uncertain about coming, but because she was coming from the airport. A red-eye from the corridor operations zone, a change in transit, 4 hours of sleep in a seat that was not designed for sleeping. She still had her bag on her shoulder when she walked through the door and stopped at the sight of all 12 of them arranged around the pushed-together tables at Marta's, which looked exactly the same as it had in January, except that someone had put a string of lights in the window, blinking in irregular intervals the way cheap lights always did. Someone had ordered her coffee already. It was at the end of the table. She sat down. For a moment nobody said anything, and then everyone said something at once, and the specific noise of that, the overlapping voices, the bad jokes, the competitive retelling of events they'd all been present for, was exactly the right sound for the morning. Ethan was across from her. He looked different in 12 months the way people look different when something has been working on them. Not older exactly, but more definite, more himself in a way that was hard to articulate but clear to see. "How's the corridor?" he said. "Cold. The eastern approach has been contested for 3 weeks. We moved 60 families last month." 60. He nodded. The weight of the number was present in the nod. "How's the institution?" she said. "Complicated." He said it with the dry accuracy of someone who had fully accepted the word. "The post-investigation restructuring has been," he considered, "instructive. There are people in positions now who weren't in those positions a year ago. Some of them are better than what was there before. Some of them are navigating exactly what the people before them navigated because the position requires it. The institution is the institution. But it shifted. It shifted. A little." A pause. "Enough to matter. Maybe. I think about that differently on different days." She looked at him. "Is it still the right work?" He was quiet for a moment. She watched him consider it honestly, the way he always seemed to consider things, not looking for the comfortable answer, just looking for the actual one. "For now," he said. "Yeah, for now it is." She nodded. Down the table, Munn was telling a story she had heard before, and Hatch was already preparing his objection to a specific detail, and Rains was eating her eggs with the expression of a woman who had heard both versions of this story multiple times and had developed opinions about both of them. Burns was laughing at something Kessler had said. The lights in the window blinked in their uneven rhythm. Lena drank her coffee. It was good. It was the same coffee. Marta's was consistent, which was a form of reliability she'd come to appreciate in the months since January. The same menu on the same whiteboard with the same ghost lettering underneath. The same table. 12 people who were different in the specific ways that 11 months and continued living make people different, but recognizably themselves. Recognizably here. She thought about the roof, about the cold, about 18 rounds and 12 lives, and the particular silence of a decision made alone in the dark with no audience and no approval and no certainty about what it would cost. She thought about the earpiece she'd removed and set on the concrete, and about how that gesture, that small, deliberate act of setting something down, had been the beginning of everything that followed. She didn't regret it. She had not regretted it on the night, or in the 6 weeks of suspension, or in the hearing room, or in the 8 months of investigation, or in any of the mornings since. That was not the same as saying it had been easy, or that the cost had been what she would have chosen if the costs had been available for choosing. It was just the truth, that on the night of December 24th, she had looked through a scope at the distance between 12 lives and the end of them, and she had done the arithmetic that she knew how to do better than almost anyone alive, and she had decided that the right number was not 0. The rest was paperwork. Munn's story concluded to general disagreement, and someone ordered more coffee, and the lights in the window blinked on, and the morning moved through itself the way ordinary mornings do when the extraordinary thing that preceded them has settled into memory. 12 people. 1 table. December 24th, 1 year later. Alive. All of them. There's a particular kind of courage that never gets recorded on the night it happens. Not in orders, not in communications, Not in any document that anyone files before morning. It happens in the dark, alone, in the space between what you've been told to do and what you know is right, and the only witness is the decision itself. The world doesn't always reward that courage. Sometimes it punishes it. Sometimes it buries it under language designed to make the inconvenient truth disappear. But sometimes, not always, not automatically, not without cost, the truth is heavier than the language trying to cover it, and it surfaces anyway. That is what 12 people who are still alive know, on a cold December morning, drinking coffee at a table pushed together in a breakfast place that smells like bacon grease, and the particular ordinary warmth of a room full of people who chose to be in the same room. Sometimes the most important order you'll ever follow is the one only your conscience gives.